from onlinechesslessons.net, and I'm going to be looking at the French defense and how to play the French against the advanced variation. And so I'm going to start off with an example from 2010, and this was Kick versus Korchnoi. Viktor Korchnoi, one of the most legendary players of the French defense ever. He's been rocking it for about 4 decades now. And so we're going to start off by looking at one of the variations in the advanced variation that I personally like to play myself, and I think it really can give black a lot of troubles if he's not well prepared. So we're going to start off. I know you might be thinking this is the Sicilian defense, but what we're seeing here is a simple transposition of openings. By the way, this is a common, if you like to play the Sicilian defense as well, and you come up against the C3 Sicilian here, transposing to the French defense with E6 and D5 is a nice way to sidestep the C3 Sicilian. And so essentially here we've arrived at the starting position of the French defense, the advanced variation. And so black's plan, you'll see this Queen B6 a lot of times coming out early, and it's really going to be followed by Knight C6. And so here we've got the branching out point for white of what he wants to play. And so what I mean by that is really white's got a lot of not so many different choices here, but this is where it starts becoming different lines. So black can play, for example, Bishop D3 is going to usually lead to the Milner Gambit, where white is offering to sacrifice a pawn for lead and development and piece play activity and whatnot. And also this move A3, which has become extremely popular lately. Fabiano Caruana played it very recently. He won a really nice game against Francisco Vallejo Pons at Bilbao 2012. And anyway, I mean, right now, the Milner Berry is a dangerous line. People still play it these days. I think Morezovich, Topalov, they even still play the Milner Berry, even in the age of computers, sacrificing a pawn in the first 10 moves. Something very interesting. The Milner Berry is dangerous. But we're going to start off right now with what I think is the most critical line, with A3 here. And you might be thinking this is a pretty weird move to be the most critical line. However, white is really just starting to gain a lot of counterplay on the queen side by playing B4. And then he's really going to have a really nice space advantage. If white has a space advantage in the center with the pawn wedge on E5, and on the queen side by pushing the pawn to B4, he's going to have a lot of things going for him. It's going to be really tough for black to create good counterplay. And so after this A3 move, right, he's starting to play B4. Black has a lot of options here, a lot of options. You can push the pawn to C4. This is a very interesting line. You can check out GM Akobian out in California. He likes to play this a lot with the black pieces here. And this move C4, while it is really goes against every principle in the French defense of not closing the center, it does create a very different type of position, and it really directly exploits. Every pawn move creates a weakness. Well, this pawn move to A3 weakened the B3 square. And so black, normally falls up Bishop D7, Knight A5, and even castles queenside in this line. Very interesting line, but a very different way of playing. And if you don't have a lot of time to do a lot of research, I'd recommend just stay away from it. Stick to the more general principles, which means black is going to try to create a lot of pressure against white's D4 pawn, possibly to undermine it, usually to undermine white's center in the future by pushing the pawn to F6 as well. And so that's really black's idea. First create pressure on D4, and then probably also try to create some pressure on E5 here as well. So, to explain kind of black's basic options against the 6A3 line, one move, Knight H6, is quite interesting, really just aiming for rapid development, trying to jam the knight to the center. That's cool. Knight H6 is nice. Bishop E7, you see every now and then. I'm not such a big fan. Bishop D7, this is okay, but I'm not so crazy about it either. The move that I like the most is the move we're looking at here. Again, this was Kick versus Korchnoi 2010. I've got the notes to this game in the article with this video. And so A5 here, this is my favorite move for black. And so it's very simple. White plays A3, we play A5. White's not going to play B4 now. It's not going to happen. And so, a5 is pretty interesting. I mean, this is really the advanced variation. Even though it seems so natural and direct and logical for white to just push the pawn, it really does create some positions that are quite different from other lines in the French defense. And so, basically, what I like about a5 is, first of all, we can kind of stick to our traditional lines in the French defense, which is nice if you don't have a ton of time to dedicate to learning openings, if you prefer to work on other parts of your game. But what we're going to see with this a5 move is actually quite useful in a lot of different positions, because later we can play moves like a4, and we can play knight to a5, for example, and we're going to start taking advantage of white's weakened light squares on the queen side, on b3 and on c4. And so that's what I like about the a5 move, is first of all, we prevent white from playing b4, which I think is very nice, enabling us to stick to our more traditional lines and the general lines of the French defense. And secondly, because later in the game, it's very useful to play a4 and gain a lot of counterplay on the queen side. And so we'll take a look at how Korchnoi works about this here. This idea of playing for counterplay on the queen side should be reserved for later in the game. And it's much better to first play moves like knight h6 to f5, or even knight e7 to g6, to put pressure on e5. It's better to first establish pressure against white's extended pawn center, to tie white's pieces down, and then start with operations like I was mentioning with a4 and trying to play on the queen side. So in the position here, white plays bishop d3. This is a very common trick in the advanced variation, and don't get got. Don't get fooled. The pawn's not free. If you take here, you're going to lose your queen. Simply a little check. Discover attack on the black queen, and that's a free queen. So don't get got. That's what they say, right? It's not free. This pawn on d4 is not free. And so the move here, Korchnoi plays bishop d7, and now he really is threatening to take the pawn, because now, just to take a look at this a little bit slower, let's say white just castles. Now we can capture on d4. The pawn takes. Knight takes. So if he takes again. And now with the bishop on d7, there's no discover check. And so you're good to go. There's no check either by taking h7, for example, if black was castled. So you can snatch the pawn on d4 sometimes, but it's very dangerous. So I would just caution on general principles, if you haven't studied that extensively, just stay away from it. Or think twice. If it looks too good to be true, it probably is. And so in this game, kick with white here, he just plays bishop c2. This is a fairly common maneuver in response to bishop d7. And now the queen is, again, defending the d4 pawn. And so Korchnoi plays kind of an interesting plan in this game. He decides to capture here on d4. And that's fairly normal. It just helps kind of clarify things on the queen side. And he puts a knight on g6. Normally you put the knight on f5, but there are some differences. And so we'll see this coming up in this video here. So the knight on g6, very, very obvious, just it's putting pressure on e5. And so that's cool. It's also very solid. Maybe it's blocking this diagonal for if black wants to castle kingside, maybe that'll be nice. The knight can be helping out defend there. So white, just knight to c3. This is a very standard developing move. And black as well, bishop e7. And now white plays g3. And, g3 is kind of an interesting move. It looks like, why would he play g3? Well, if he wanted to play f4, he'd have to move his knight. And he can't do that right now with his knight protecting, tied down and protecting the pawn on d4. So I think the idea with g3 is kind of a common way to attack this knight here on g6. I think it's setting up h4, and white would play h5 and try to gain a little more space and initiative on the king side. And so black plays f6. This is pretty dangerous to play f6 so early, something I would again caution against. However, I think it's okay in this position. I mean, f6, it's not like it's a bad move here, but it is dangerous with a king in the center. That is definitely something to keep in mind. If this rook was on the e-file, for example, this would be a very dangerous move. And it still is here. It requires some good calculation to play f6 with the king still in the center. But we're going to see that black really gets a pretty good game here. I mean, first of all, G3 was threatening H4, so maybe Korchnoi was just like, hey, man, I don't want to allow H4 and H5. Why do I need to allow that? And instead, he just plans to immediately strike at white center and establish a focal point for his pieces on the pawn on D4. So it's a pretty good idea. And so what this does essentially forces knight to A4 here, driving back black's queen, because white can't really defend the pawn any other way. If he tries bishop E3, seems like it's dangerous, but maybe doable for black to snatch this pawn here. Definitely something to consider. I mean, maybe it's a little too crazy. Maybe this isn't going to quite work. It looks like a move like bishop D3. Yikes. So that's something to worry about too. Snatching that pawn on B2, if it looks too good to be true, this is a dangerous pawn to snatch, and there's no doubt about that. So I think bishop to E3 honestly was probably white's best move here. Just, said, do you really want to take the pawn? But he chose a direct variation where he's going to push black's queen back away from this pawn on B2. Also the knight eyeing the C5 square. And in the game, Korchnoi kept it cool. I mean, I like this. Queen A7, it's kind of a goofy move, but very simple. Just it's putting a lot of pressure on white's D4 pawn. So white's got to defend that pressure. And black castles. And so now the G3 move almost kind of looks silly because it's softened up the F3 square. And now with black, after having played F6, he's got the open F file. And it seems like that knight is going to be quite loose on F3 there. And so white proceeds with knight to C5. So this is definitely a good square for the knight. Black's got to defend. Centralizing the rooks is always a good idea. If he wants to open the position later with E5, this rook will be very well placed here on the D file. And now, I really like this move by Korchnoi, just bishop c8. He just goes back. The bishop is still defending e6, but he wants to maintain the two bishops, and it looks like he's got a really nice plan of playing b6. Fits in very nicely with this a5 move earlier, and bringing the bishop to a6, where it's going to be on an awesome diagonal. And so white, bishop to a4, this is a nice move. He's stopping b6 for the moment. And black just goes back. So he really wants to play b6 and kick away the knight here on c5. And also the knight to e7. I know this looks weird, but it's actually it's a very good maneuver. Bring the knight to f5, and even from there it can go to d6 if it wants. It is going to be excellent for black. And so white, he foresees black wants to play b6 and bishop a6. So he just goes ahead and moves the rook. And also the rook is, well placed here. So black waits. Prefers to shuffle his knights, put them in better positions here. And so now black decides to go with b6. White had really centralized the queen very nicely. And so this is a pretty typical example of the French defense. This is a great way to fight against the advanced variation, this early pawn to a5 move. And black just keeps a really nice pressure against white's isolated pawn on d4. And so we'll go a couple more moves here. Black reroutes the knight to d6. This is an awesome square for the knight, by the way. Really controlling a lot of very important central squares. And, I think, pretty much right here, I think that black is just fine. And I think this would be a very nice position to get out of the opening. We managed to trade off our light squared bishop for black and trade off white's light squared bishop, which is white's good bishop. If we look at this position, every single one of white's pawns is on a dark square, and his bishop is on dark squares too. That's a bad bishop. So I want to go ahead and continue here and take a look at another example. And this was another game by Korchnoi. This was Devoiris versus Korchnoi, and this was in 2004. And so we're going to take a look at a similar plan against this 6A3 line, but some very important differences as well, so this should help explain. So here we're seeing this is the classical move order for the advanced variation in the French, and we can see as in the first example, this is we reach the same exact position. And so Korchnoi, again, he goes with the early queen to b6. I don't think there's a huge difference with playing knight c6, honestly. But maybe, the biggest thing that I could think of is maybe white could bring the bishop to e3 then. And now if like queen to b6, maybe this is a different kind of line. So bringing the queen out to b6 immediately kind of narrows white's options. Either move I think is playable. So let's see. So we got the basic moves starting off here. This A3 idea, and in this position we're going to look at the knight to H6 line. And so the main difference is, first of all, if white captures on C5, with the knight on E7, we had to recapture with our queen. However, in this position, if he takes on C5, we can recapture with the bishop. That's good. That would be nice. But with the knight on H6, the options are also a little more limited. For example, now we know that the knight is definitely going to go to F5. White knows that, at least. White knows the knight is going to F5. And so, also, one thing I'd really like to say, very important about this, you do not need to worry about white giving up his dark squared bishop for the knight to double the pawns. I know it looks really ugly, but black is going to get more than sufficient compensation by the open G file, and also having the two bishops, the weakness of the B2 pawn, for example. There's also some tactics here. Let's say if bishop takes knight, just going back here, so in this position, bishop takes knight, and queen takes B2. And, just some interesting lines to keep in mind here, that black has got some resources if bishop takes knight on H6. Really not anything too dangerous. White plays bishop D3, however, and we're going to see a similar tactic, that black cannot take on D4 because of the discovered check on B5. All right, so we can't take on D4. So remember that. Don't fall for the easy ones. So, in the game we see Korchnoi actually doesn't play A5, and I'm not so crazy about this because he didn't end up playing A5. He plays, but it's a different plan. He's playing for a lot of activity, and so now, for example, if B4 is still not going to quite work, as now we actually can take the pawn and quite successfly, as there's no discovered check on B5. So it's still a pretty cool plan by black. And in the game, we're going to see white play bishop to C2 again, not trying to gambit the D4 pawn. Now black plays A5. So he does want to stop B4. Before he was just really trying to achieve really active pressure, really rapid pressure against white's center. And so we're just going to go through and see kind of a common plan in the late opening, early middle game here. Black strives to finish development. With this B3 move, it seems like white is signaling that he wants to play bishop to B2, and possibly even C4 in the future, just blasting open the center. And so black goes ahead and captures on D4. I like the capture on D4. I do like this quite a bit. It does clarify a lot in the position. Also, it brings knight F5 with greater effect. Now the knight is directly threatening to capture. For example, a move like G4 when the pawn was back on C3. Say knight here. White maybe could play G4. It's not the best move in the world for white, but that's something you got to remember when you bring this knight to H6 and F5 like this so fast. You still got to calculate G4, and now we can see that black's knight is not going to be able to capture on D4 with the pawn on C3. So that's, I think, why we see a little clarification in the center. Black captures on D4. Now he plays knight F5. And so here white actually captures the knight on F5. And, this position can be a little misleading, because it looks like black is just going to lose badly because his pawns are so splintered, especially the D5 pawn's really weak. White plays knight C3. Black has to play bishop E6. I mean, this is just a big pawn, essentially, right now. This light squared bishop on E6, a horrible piece. But on the flip side, black does have the two bishops, so that's cool. If the position opens up later, that will benefit black. And also, this pawn here on F5 maybe can support a kingside attack. Now that's what I like to do with the pawn on F5. And another benefit for black is actually a con for white. White gave up his light squared bishop. His good light squared bishop. You'll notice white's pawns are on dark squares here, as usually in the French, and so his light squared bishop was his good bishop. Was able to work with these pawns, and now he's given that up, and he's left with just the bad dark squared bishop. So we'll take a look at some nice ideas by both sides. White is trying to stick the knight on F4, possibly play bishop G5, and some combination in there. And black plays h6, so he wants to play g5 and start, really rolling these pawns here on the king side. White wants to inhibit that idea with h4. And so black plays g6. Might seem like kind of a weird move, but the reason is that if he plays queen d8 here for black, it seems like white could play h5, and it just establishes this annoying bind. And for example, if g5 now, maybe we take, and the knight on f4, and I'm not seeing anything super concrete here, but this looks really annoying for black. I mean, he has a very loose position, very loose. I mean, probably king f7 is something, but it's anyway. I mean, I don't want to get too carried away. Just that's a pretty loose position, and so that's why Korchnoi in the game plays g6. Now if h5, he just goes g5. It's no big deal. And so white continues with g3, trying to play solidly. Black plays queen d8, sticking to his guns here. Wants to play g5. White wants to occupy the h file, it seems like. And so what we see is after g5, black does, he gets some nice play. And so white plays rook h1. This is important in this line, especially with your king in the center still. Black can leave his king in the center, really, right here. It's not that big of a deal. The center is very closed. White can't really open the center. So black can probably leave his king in the center. He shouldn't have any problems. His rooks, this guy can operate, the queenside rook can operate on the c-file, and the kingside rook can probably just try to maintain these big pawns. So in this position, it'd be a big mistake, I think, to capture on h1 and simply give white an incredibly active queen on the h-file. So after rook g8, we'll just look at a little bit more. I think right here this is probably enough. I'm convinced that black has a very nice position out of the opening. The plan moving forward, I would think something like, maybe even king to d7 if you wanted to connect everything and try to blast through with f4. King d7, let's say, rook g6, queen g8, playing something like f4. That looks like a really cool plan. And it seems like it's going to bring a lot of firepower right at white's king. You'd also put the rook on c8 there. And so that's going to do it for the 6a3 line that we were just looking at. That's the 6a3 line. Start with a normal advanced variation. This is the line we've just looked at these past two games with 6 to a3. And now we're going to look at some different things in the advanced variation. Really, I want to look at the Milner-Berry Gambit and just make a few general recommendations, as this line is very dangerous. So let's say we start off here with, it seems to be the most popular choice among grandmasters today. I see, for example, Morozevich, he plays this a lot, immediate queen b6. And after knight c6, the other main option, other than playing a3 here, the other main option for white is to play bishop to d3. And so this is going to be the start of the Milner-Berry Gambit. And so black should play bishop d7, at least threaten to take the pawn. And so now if white castles, he really is offering the pawn. This is the Milner-Berry Gambit. The problem for black is that this is incredibly complicated. It looks easy. I used to think it was a pretty basic opening. I mean, white wants to give a pawn, a protected pass pawn at that. Let's take it. Let's take a look. This is a starting position for the Milner-Berry. You can see stuff like knight c3 here, bishop e3. I think the most common move is going to be rook to e1 and trying to play bishop to e3 next. Stuff like that. I mean, the Milner-Berry gets crazy. This is the starting position. Black gets a free pawn. But, nothing good is free, as they say. And here, I think it's simply too dangerous for black. If you don't know this line very well, if you're not studying this a lot, this is more for beginner and intermediate players. So if you want to focus on smoothing out the rough edges of your game, focusing on your positional strategy and your in-game technique instead of studying so many complicated openings, which I would recommend. I would recommend smoothing out the rough edges of your game than focusing on the openings so much. I would really recommend that you just avoid the Milner-Berry. It's not the end of the world if you don't take the pawn. It's not like white gets a crushing position. And there's really some easy ways to do that. So let's take a look at some of the main ideas if black wants to avoid accepting the pawn. And actually here I'm going to recommend a5. I know this seems kind of crazy. This doesn't really make sense. White wasn't really trying to play a3 and b4. However, he was trying to play b4. In a lot of these lines, doing a lot of research, I noticed that if black plays a normal move, let's say something like knight to h6 or knight to e7, I mean, either one of these, knight e7 particularly can lead you into trouble because white can actually take the pawn. And after queen takes, something like bishop e3, so you got to move the queen. Now even playing b4. And I think this should make it pretty clear that this is not very comfortable for black in this position. He's really getting pushed around. White is just getting a lot of space and development for free. I don't like it. So that b4 concept, even if you play knight to h6, a lot of times white can still capture. At first I didn't think this was so powerful, but I looked at a lot of games and it really just seems to give white a very nice initiative. Just push him back. And the same stuff, either bishop to e3, we could go rook e1, even a4, just directly, just trying to go crazy and gain a bunch of space on the queen side, maybe opening up soon with c4. I don't like to allow this b4. And so what I would recommend, instead of kind of a more normal developing move like knight h6 or knight e7, I would just recommend to play a5. And, well, the lines are actually going to be pretty similar to what we looked at with the a3 line. I think black gets a very fine game, and there's absolutely nothing to worry about. I mean, just stick to your guns. Pressure white's center on d4, and then try to undermine it by playing f6. Undermine it directly, undermining e5 with f6. And so, just a sample play. I mean, you can still take the pawn, but I don't know. I would still be kind of sketched out. I mean, rook e1 is a very natural move in the Milner-Berry. a5 is not. So white will probably continue offering you the pawn if he's a real Milner-Berry Gambit player. And I would continue declining it until you feel 100% comfortable and sure that you can accept it without getting yourself into trouble. And so maybe even just knight to knight e7. Or maybe you can capture on d4. The problem with capturing is you do allow the c3 square. It's not the end of the world. We could even go with something like this. You got to be a little careful putting the knight on f5, especially the knight on c3. This is not going to work. That's going to lose a pawn. But I think even just putting the knight on g6, and let's say, okay, white finally wants to defend the pawn. And in this position, we have a very traditional position, the French defense. Black can play f6 soon. He can castle, and he's going to be doing just fine. So that's going to wrap things up here for this this video on the advanced variation of the French defense. In the first lines that we covered today, with the 6a3 move right here, I recommend just playing really a5. I think is the best move. Just don't allow b4. And against the Milner-Berry Gambit, just to recap, bishop d3, be extremely cautious about taking the pawn. And I'd also recommend to play a5, not allowing white to expand on the queen side with b4. So that's going to do it. My name is Will Stewart from OnlineChessLessons.net, and thanks for tuning in.